Welcome to The Complete Works, an official podcast of FilmBook. The Complete Works is a podcast that delves film by film into the filmography of a Hollywood actor, director, writer, or composer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Complete Works podcast, a film career podcast brought to you by FilmBook. My name is Doug Hess. If you're tuning in to the Complete Works podcast for the first time, what I do on this podcast is discuss a specific movie from a film actor, actress, director, or composer's film career. I am currently working my way through Christopher Nolan's film career, and in this episode of the Complete Works podcast, I'll be discussing the film Dunkirk. Find more information about the Complete Works podcast episodes on FilmBook, that's film-book.com, or by searching the term The Complete Works. If you're listening to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast service, please rate and review this episode. If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, please like our video, subscribe, and consider becoming one of our patrons on patrons at patreon.com/FilmBook. Your support helps us create more engaging content. And as I said, we're going to be looking at Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk. And, a lot of times people ask me, what did you think of this particular film or a particular film that we're going to be talking about? But before I give you that, basically I want to give you just a quick second overview of what the movie is. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may have not. So basically this movie was released in 2017, and it's really an epic historical war thriller that was written and directed by Christopher Nolan. And it's set in the 1940s during the Battle of France, and Allied soldiers retreat to Dunkirk, the city. And they are encircled by the enemy, and basically what they have to do is the only way that if there's even a chance to escape, they're going to have to do it by water or by sea, if you will, and escape there. Think of it as here in the States as our Pearl Harbor. This is one of their defining moments in World War II. So I think it's really important to kind of set that up. What are my thoughts on the film? Well, a couple things, and we're going to be touching about this throughout this episode because I think it's really important. Number one, it's a historical war thriller, And any time that you're dealing with something based on history, that gets a little touchy in my opinion. How accurate is it? How much does Hollywood, if you will, use their license to be able to kind of exaggerate? Because let's face it, some things in history are really, really important, but they're kind of dull or maybe even boring. And so you've got an important event, and sometimes Hollywood has to inject a little bit of a lie, those are my words, in order to get this film through. I'm not saying that that's what happened here in Dunkirk. I'm just trying to set you that bar because I think it's important to keep that in the back of your mind. The second takeaway when I have thoughts on this film, there's not a lot of dialogue in here. Matter of fact, and we'll go in this in a little bit more detail, but Tom Hardy is in this film, and I think he only has like 7 lines, maybe a dozen lines in the whole film. He's playing in an airplane, an air fighter. That's not the word I'm looking for, but I'm drawing a complete blank, to be honest with you. And his face is covered up the majority of the movie. And so that's a couple of things. Like I said, one, it's a historical film, but number two, there's not a lot of lines, actual words being spoken. There's action, there's sound, etc., that are really driving this film. And I would be remiss if I didn't point that out early on in the film. So that's going to kind of set things up for my thoughts on the film. So what is the setting of Dunkirk in the film? This really kind of begs the question is, how is Christopher Nolan going to write a film and direct a film that is different? I mean, you take a piece of history, and how are you going to present it in a way that is different, that is interesting, and is fresh or new? And that's kind of a tall order for anybody to do. And I think if anybody can do it, Christopher Nolan is definitely that individual that can do it. Now, I am not saying that this film doesn't have war in it, because it does. It has a lot of war in it. When I mean war, I'm talking about bombs. I'm talking about gunfire. I'm talking about arsenal that's in there. So that makes up the majority of the film. And there's people dying in the film. And it's not like it's just... it doesn't have the feel of war, because I think it does. And I think, in my personal opinion, that is what really separates and makes Dunkirk a fascinating film, is that that's the fresh aspect. And my takeaway when it comes from Dunkirk is that Christopher Nolan makes you feel like you're there, right in the middle of this war, this evacuation that is taking place there at Dunkirk. I don't think a lot of films can do that. We'll talk about some comparisons here in just a few minutes where films that I think kind of does that. But let me continue on with a few other thoughts that I have about this film. There's three narratives, or three takeaways from this film that I think are important. One, the main narrative in the movie is that you're trying to have this experience of men on the beach. There's some 400,000 British and Allied troops that are trapped on this French beach, and they have to get out. Most of them, if not the majority of them, are really young sailors or soldiers, and they, by all means possible, they want to get home. So that's number one. Number two, the experience is the men in the air, because not only is there fighting on the ground, and men are really scared in war, but you also have these dogfights and these great scenes taking place in the air. And I think that's important. So not only do you have air support above that's taking place, but you also have the soldiers on the ground. And then thirdly is the experience of the civilians, because it's actually the civilians that are bringing their individual boats. So they're not leaving on military boats trying to get off of this beach, but they're actually on little sailboats and yachts. And it's made up of hundreds and thousands of civilians that are coming to the rescue of these young soldiers, some 400,000 of these. So I think you take the three of them, or those three narratives, and that's what makes a really interesting and new, fresh approach. Again, you have civilians, you have the soldiers on the beach, and then you have the soldiers in the air that's really having this great combination that takes place. The other interesting fact about this film, and so many other war films, you see both sides. You either see the British versus the Germans, or the U.S. versus the Germans, or you name it in history. In terms of that, you know who you're fighting. And what's really interesting about this film, and the way that Christopher Nolan directed this film and really wrote it, is that you know you're fighting the Germans, but you never see the Germans at all in this film. And at the very last, you kind of see a figure that looks like the enemy that is approaching in, but because of the smoke that's out there, you really don't get to see a face. So that, to me, is what's very interesting about this film. And that's my takeaway. And I'll do a quick recap. One, is a historical film that you got to be careful. You're like, how accurate is this? Number two, there's not a lot of dialogue, which that's something that I think a lot of the audience feels a little uncomfortable with, because we're so used to going to a film and hearing nothing but dialogue. Number three is the setting. You know, how is Christopher Nolan going to really make this something different, or is it just going to be another boring movie that we see. And I think Christopher Nolan does this, like I said, by 3 narratives, making sure that we experience with the men on the beach their fearfulness and them getting attacked. Number 2, we have that experience with those in the air, providing air support for the men that's on the beach. And then finally, the experience of the civilians, making sure that, that they're getting that respect and that help is coming from really an unlikely source, and that is civilians. Usually in a war movie, it's the soldiers rescuing the civilians, and he kind of like gives the old, flips the tables on everybody, and it's the civilians rescuing the soldiers. So that's kind of my quick overview of the thoughts. Without characters, you're not going to have a film. And so we're not going to go over every single person that's in here, but I've decided to pick out about 4 individuals that I want to talk about, and one of them is Tom Hardy. So he plays a fighter pilot trying to blast German pilots and airplanes out of the sky, and is trying to protect the men on the ground in terms of that. Again, like I said just a few minutes ago, Tom Hardy does not have a lot of lines in this movie, and his face is masked. We're going to talk a little bit about that, why that's significant when we get to the trivia here in just a few minutes. But you have an individual, and I think that's important when it comes to a character and an actor, to basically be able to make you feel like you're in the cockpit with him, you're fighting the Germans. That takes a little bit of a talent, because your face is covered because they have the oxygen mask on, and then you don't have a lot of lines to say anyways. And so that to me is really a quality actor or an actress. And it really says something about the director and the writer to be able to feel very confident that they're able to pull the performance out of somebody with very few lines. That means that they're really, in my opinion, they're really focusing on their acting ability. So Tom Hardy, like I said, plays a fighter pilot. He's flying around protecting the troops on the ground, but his face is covered the majority of the time, and he doesn't have a lot of lines in the film, and I think that's really important. And he pulls it off very, very nicely. Mark Rylance, he plays a civilian with with teenage sons, who is damned and determined to make sure that he is going out there with a small little yacht, and he is going to help some of these soldiers rescue as many as he possibly can from the beach, come hell or high water, into this. I think that's very interesting because, again, we have civilians who are not used to war, and they're going into harm's way. And again, I really enjoyed the way that the script has been flipped a little bit on us as the audience, because it's typically the soldiers going in at all costs. They're not afraid, or if they are afraid, they don't show it. They have little fear that they're going in to protect us, and that script gets turned, and I think Mark does a wonderful job of portraying. I mean, how could you not be fearful, but also knowing that if you don't go in there and save these young men, they're most likely going to die. And so putting away your fear, your concerns, and taking your family and going into harm's way, again, without a lot of words being spoken on the big screen, I think is very important. Harry Styles is another individual. As so many, he really doesn't have a huge role. He plays a soldier who rushes into town that the beach is on, which is Dunkirk, and basically what he wants to do is to try to escape. You know, how can he help these ships that are coming into the port, into the dock, get in without getting damaged, so all these soldiers can jump on and then hightail it out of there in terms of that. And then lastly, Cillian Murphy. What's really interesting about this, he's in the film. He is only known as, if you check the credit, it's the Shivering Soldier, and he's pulled from an icy sea by Mark Rylance, his boat, and strongly urges the crew to sail away from Dunkirk and not towards it. So let me again set the scene. So Murphy's character doesn't have a name. All he is just an average soldier that is shivering in the cold water. He gets rescued by Mark's civilian and his son's boat. He's pulled into the water, and he knows what is coming from the Germans and what they went through on that beach, that he is trying to convince to go in the opposite direction. Almost like, forget everybody else that didn't make it. It's too dangerous. It's too scary to go back. I don't care what happens. You almost get that feeling like, I don't even care if somebody calls me a coward, because I know what's back there, and I'll be damned if I want to go back to where I just came from. And so I think those are some very interesting dynamics that make up this film with the characters. And again, I think it's so important. I keep saying this over and over again. There's not a lot of dialogue in the film, okay? You may be getting tired of me saying that, but I really think that just really goes to the trust that the director has in his cast, but also the ability with these actors to be able to portray that on screen and not have the dialogue to for lack of a better word, kind of hide behind. That their acting ability is on that. The other thing I want to talk about is, how does this compare to other films? And I'm going to take this a couple different ways. One is to other war films. Christopher Nolan does a really good job, I feel, of making you feel like you're in this film, that you're on this beach and you are trying like hell to get out because you know the Germans are coming. The other film that I think that kind of made me feel this way is Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. I think that's the other film that I would say gave me that same feeling, especially when you're rushing the beaches of Normandy on D-Day and all the gunfire and people are dying. And again, there wasn't a lot of dialogue at the beginning of that film as people were rushing, the men were rushing the beaches that day. So in terms of that, I think that's really the only film that I could really come up with that really compares and gives me that feeling of being in the war. I mean, there's a lot of great war movies out there, but I think those are the Saving Private Ryan and Dunkirk are the ones that make me feel like I was there. The others makes me feel like I'm watching a movie. Nothing against them. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful films out there. But if I'm just comparing them to the feeling, I think Saving Private Ryan does that. Now, I said I was going to do this a couple different ways. How do I compare this to other Christopher Nolan films? The only other film that I could really compare this to, in my personal opinion, is Memento. Just the way that this film felt fresh and new. So Memento is basically, the film is working backwards to solve a puzzle. In terms of that, with Dunkirk, you feel like you're in the movie. You're on the beach. You're trying to escape from the Germans. There's gunfire, there's bombs, there's airplanes circling all over. And I really think those are a couple of films that really jump out to me that are different and new. And, Memento, the way Christopher Nolan had written and directed that film is a comparison that really jumps out at me in terms of this. Do I think this is a good film? I do. I'll give you my rankings at the very end, like I usually do. Overall, I thought this was a good film for a lot of the reasons that I've already mentioned. One is that there's not a lot of dialogue, and so you're really dealing or relying a lot on the actor's abilities, and that's not easy. Not everybody can pull something like this off. So I think that's really important to me. I think from a historical standpoint, I think they get it right the majority of the time, and this is not a criticism of anybody. Again, it's movie. It's supposed to be entertaining, and so to a degree, I'm okay with having that license to kind of play fast and loose with certain things in terms of this. I'm not looking at it to be historically accurate. And I'm okay with that. I think the cast was well done. And again, my hat's off to those to be able to have a performance that is so powerful that their actions make up for the lack of words being uttered on the screen, on the silver screen, in terms of that. The other thing is this one of Christopher Nolan's best films? I don't know. I don't necessarily think it's his best film or the greatest film, but I think it's right up there. And the other thing that is why I think this is a good film is this is something I wasn't expecting from Christopher Nolan, because all of his other films, he didn't tackle something that was based on a true event. The story itself is not necessarily true, but let me say this. The story that he wrote is not necessarily true, but the story that it's based on is actually true. Dunkirk and the way that the civilians came in to take those young, brave men off of the beach at Dunkirk. So in that sense, again, I think it's a very good, solid film, and I really appreciate the way that Christopher Nolan was not afraid at all to tackle something as historic as Dunkirk. I think some people would have just absolutely shied away from it, but he was not afraid to do that, and my hat's off to him for that. So that's really kind of my take or my review of Dunkirk. Production, box office, and some awards. Yes, it was nominated for Academy Awards box office. So this had a budget of approximately $100 million. It grossed in the U.S. and Canada about $189 million. Opening weekend in the U.S. and Canada was about $50 million. And it had a gross worldwide collection, if you will, of a little over $500 million, $530 million in terms of this. It was distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures in terms of that. And like I said, it grossed about $500 million worldwide, making it the highest grossing World War film until it was surpassed by another film of Christopher Nolan's based on World War II that we're going to be talking about here in just a few episodes, Oppenheimer, in terms of that. So very good job by Christopher Nolan in terms of that. It was up for and it won 3 Academy Awards for the film. So again, very good. A couple of things I want to talk about next is some of the trivia regarding the film. Excuse me. In the sequence where the Spitfire ditches into the English Canal, an IMAX camera was strapped in the cockpit to film Jack Loudy's trying to get out. However, during the filming, the plane with the camera still inside sank quicker than predicted, and it took so long to retrieve the plane that the IMAX camera housing filled with water potentially ruined the expensive camera and the film. However, they went on to use an old movie technique to keep the film wet and shipped it back to L.A., getting it processed before it dried out. The take from the scene actually made it into the movie. So very kind of cool on that. In terms of that, at first-hand accounts of Dunkirk evacuations, Christopher Nolan revealed how young and inexperienced the soldiers were. So he decided to cast young and unknown actors for the beach setting. So he wanted to try to keep it as real as possible. And Christopher Nolan, along with his wife and a friend, made the crossing from England to Dunkirk on a boat the way the civilians would have done it during the original evacuations. Nolan said it took roughly 19 hours because of the sea conditions. The end credits state that the 12 of the original little ships that participated in Dunkirk evacuation appeared in the movie, which was reenacting their presence there in 1940. Despite the fact that the Germans are shooting and bombing the Allied forces throughout the movie, no German troops are actually visible until the film's final shot. Even then, they're out of focus and in the shadow, which we talked a little bit about that. I think is very, very, very interesting in terms of that. The movie was shot on the actual beach at Dunkirk, where the evacuation actually took place. While he was scouting for the movie, Christopher Nolan found a button from an English soldier's uniform in the sand. This is something else I thought was very interesting, and I hope you guys will catch this. The title Dunkirk is divided into 3 segment colors: blue sky, dark water, and white, referring to the trilogy of the air, sea, and land. In this movie, many soldiers curse the Royal Air Force for not protecting them from the bombers. What is not mentioned at all is that the Royal Air Force was already out attacking the bombers, sent to bomb the soldiers on the beach, and the bombers that did attack were the ones that got past the fighters. These dogfights occurred more inland from Dunkirk, which is why the soldiers on the beach didn't see any of the fighters during the evacuation, and why they thought they had been abandoned in the process. Near the end of the movie, a Spitfire without fuel is seen shot down by a dive bomber. This is historically correct. The Succus were notorious easy target for fighter planes, especially when preparing to dive. In the following Battle of Britain, a significant number were shot down. And that's one thing that I don't think we really touched on enough, is that I think Christopher Nolan wanted to get this as accurate as possible, and I think he did a pretty good job of doing that. Christopher Nolan got the idea for this movie in 1992 while sailing to Dunkirk with his girlfriend, later became his wife. The movie used over 50 boats on the sea and 10 on the beach. When asked why he cast Harry Styles in the movie, Christopher Nolan said, "I auditioned literally thousands of young men with different combinations of men, and he had it," end quote. Hollywood Reporter stated that Sir Christopher Nolan received a $20 million salary against 20% of the box office gross, the biggest deal of any director at the time. However, Peter Jackson, who would go on to receive the same amount from King Kong in 2005. However, Vanity Fair reported that Nolan agreed to receive a low upfront salary in exchange for a large back-end percentage. In terms of that, this is the third Christopher Nolan movie to be written entirely by him. The following, in 1998, Inception 2010, and Memento in 2000 was based on a short story by his brother. The Dark Knight in 2008, The Prestige 2006, and The Dark Knight Rises 2012, and Interstellar in 2014 were all co-written by Jonathan Nolan and himself. In terms of that, just a couple more here. Around 1,000 extras were used in this film. According to Christopher Nolan, the tension that he feels watching Saving Private Ryan was not the tension he wanted for this movie, and that came out in 1998. Even though I think that, for me, I felt like there was that tension that was in there. At an hour and 46 minutes, this is Christopher Nolan's shortest movie since his debut, The Following in 1998. Again, a couple other quick things that I would say. In a podcast, Quentin Tarantino called this his second favorite film of the decade. In terms of that, the production used 20 ships that were used in the real-life evacuation. In terms of that, there's only 2 women that are in the whole film. That is pretty remarkable that they actually make this whole film, and there's only 2 women that's in the whole film in terms of that. So hopefully you enjoy Dunkirk as much as I enjoyed not only watching it, but also giving you a review and my thoughts on it. I told you a little earlier in the podcast that I would give it a ranking on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being terrible and 10 being absolute a grand slam. I'd give this film an 8. I really enjoyed this film. One is probably because I love historical films and a little bit of a history buff myself. But most importantly, again, I've said this once, I'll say it 1,000 times. I'm just really impressed with the lack of verbal communication in this film. That does not always work. And my hat's off to Christopher Nolan to want to try to get it as real as possible and be able to do something different and fresh with something that was as important as the evacuation of Dunkirk. Well, I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Complete Works podcast. Be sure to like this episode and subscribe for future episodes. You'll find FilmBook on all major social media networks, so give us a follow. You can find more on my work on FilmBook's official website, which is film-book.com. Just search for Doug Hess or The Complete Works. You can also find me on Twitter at HessDoug14. Tune in next time when I review and analyze the next Christopher Nolan film. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to The Complete Works. Find more of The Complete Works on FilmBook, on your favorite podcast service, and on YouTube.